It's this idea that's called capitalization, and it is a concept that a very brilliant psychologist named James Flynn has written a lot about. Those of you who know something about IQ research will have heard of the Flynn effect. That's James Flynn's idea. And he's written a lot about this concept of capitalization, which is what is the rate at which a society capitalizes on its potential? In other words, what percentage of people who are capable of doing something actually end up doing that thing, right? How efficiently do we make use of the talents within a given group of people? So let me give you an example. I don't know how many of you read Michael Lewis's book, The Blind Side, which is this extraordinary book about a young man in East Memphis, a teenager, who's 6'6" and 350 pounds, and he's discovered by and adopted by a wealthy white family, and they realize that he's an extraordinary athlete, and they work with him until he becomes one of the finest offensive linemen in the country. And in fact, he's about to be drafted into the NFL as many years later and make a gajillion dollars. And it's this extraordinary story, but the part of it that always stayed with me when I read it was that right at the very end, the kid, whose name is Michael Oher, says that he's from the slums of Memphis, East Memphis, and he says, if everyone who I grew up with who was into football, who had real ability in football, actually ended up playing football, they'd need to have 2 national football leagues. And what he was saying was that that East Memphis did not do a very good job of capitalizing on its athletic ability, right? And so Lewis actually follows up on this, and he does this. He talks to some people in the East Memphis school system, and he asks them, what percentage of kids in East Memphis who get a college athletic scholarship actually end up going to college? And the answer was 1 in 6. Which absolutely floored me, because I would have thought that when it comes, if there was one thing in America that we were really good at doing, it would be exploiting the athletic ability of our youth, in particular of our African American youth. I would have thought that in an inner city area, the capitalization rate for sports would have been 90%. But in fact, what we learn in East Memphis is that the capitalization rate is 1 in 6. It's 16%, right? So now think about it. If in something that we care about as much as sports, right? There's possibly nothing in American society that we devote more time and attention and intellectual resources to than the maximization of the professional sporting experience. In something that we care that much about, our cap rate is 16%. So how high must it be in things that we don't care that much about, right? That's a very sobering notion, and it says that as a society we have an awful long way to go towards properly maximizing the human potential of our members. And so I realized when I thought about that book that Outliers is really about that question. It's about identifying sources of constraints on capitalization rates and figuring out how to remove them. So what I thought I'd do is just sort of talk about a variety of these constraints. What are the kinds of things that lower cap rates in any number of different areas of human endeavor? One of the things I think is true of poverty is that we tend, even as we acknowledge its importance in constraining capitalization, we underestimate just what a powerful constraint it is. And let me give you an example. In the book I talk about the famous Terman study that was done in California. And this is a study done in the 20s, began in the 20s in California. And Terman, who is a psychologist at Stanford, in fact, the Terman who was the first dean of engineering at Stanford. In fact, isn't there a hall called Terman Hall at Stanford? How many people went to Stanford? That's this guy's son. Anyway, little side fact for those of you who went to Stanford. He does this thing where he gives an IQ test to 250,000 California school children, and he basically identifies the top 0.1%. So kids with IQs of 140 plus, genius level, essentially. And he tracks those kids for the rest of their lives, for 50 years. And he's trying to figure out what happens to them. And it's his notion starting out that he thinks, because he's so invested in the notion that IQ is the single most determinant of life success, he thinks what he's done is identified the cohort who will turn out to be the leaders in academia, in industry, in the people who will end up running all the organizations and being the top politicians and the top intellectuals, right? So he follows them for over the course of 20 and 30 years, and 20 and 30 years in he realizes actually it's not true at all. And that these kids turn out, when they turn out to be adults, they have a variety of strikingly different fates. There is a small group that does very well. The top 15% do actually occupy positions of real prominence in society. Then there's a big group in the middle who have pretty average lives. And remember, these are kids with adults with genius level IQs. And the majority of them they're kind of like, have moderately successful professional lives. And then there is a chunk at the bottom who are, by any measure, failures, whose lives turn out by any kind of occupational yardstick to be massively disappointing, who do not seem to make use of their extraordinary human potential at all. And the question that Terman has to wrestle with is, why did that group fail? What's the difference between this group who did beautifully well and this group who did so poorly at the bottom? And he runs through, this question obviously obsesses him, and he runs through every conceivable explanation for that difference. And he says, is it their personalities? And it's not. And he says, is it their habits? Is it their, it goes on and on down the list. And he realizes in the end that the answer is really, really simple. And that is that the kids who did best, these genius kids who ended up succeeding in the world, were the ones who came from wealthy households. And that the genius level kids who ended up utter failures in life were the ones who were born into poor families, right? Born into families where parents hadn't gone to college, where there weren't books in the home, where there wasn't the kind of cultural and institutional support for a habit of learning and a habit of intellectual activity. What he was saying, in other words, that even if you endow a child with a brain that is a 1 in a billion brain, that is not sufficient to ensure the success of that child. That poverty is such a powerful constraint on capitalization that it can reduce that genius child to a lifetime of worse than mediocrity, a lifetime of really profound disappointment. So that's the first constraint. Like I say, it's the obvious constraint, but I think it's important to impress on for all of us to understand that poverty is probably a bigger constraint than we think. So let's talk about some other constraints that are maybe less obvious. I got really interested in this book in looking at the composition of elite sports teams. And if you do that, you find out all kinds of strange things. So at one point, I looked at the roster of the 2007 junior Czech hockey team. Now, I did not pick that team I picked that team at random. I just was interested in that's an elite team. It was the second or third best junior hockey team in the world, after, of course, the Canadians. I'm Canadian. So it's a really elite team. These are the kind of kids who go on to play in the NHL or in the elite adult leagues in Europe. So I'm going to read to you the birth dates of the members of that national Czech team 2007. January 3rd, January 3rd, January 12th, February 8th, February 10th, February 17th, February 20th, February 24th, March 5th, March 10th, March 26th, April 22nd, May 5th, June 6th, July 2nd, July 19th, July 20th, August 15th, August 25th, August 31st, November 29th, and December 31st. Now, what's strange about that list? Right? Did you notice? 11 of the 20 names are born in January, February, and March. It is a massively skewed distribution of birth dates towards the first 3 months of the year. Now, that is not something idiosyncratic to the 2007 Czech junior hockey team. In fact, if you look at any elite hockey team anywhere in the world, and for that matter, any elite soccer team anywhere in the world, you will see the same skewed distribution. You will see that an overwhelming number of the members of those teams are born in January, February, and March. Now, why is that? The answer is that the eligibility cutoffs for age class hockey and soccer throughout the world is January 1st. And in both those sports, we very, very aggressively recruit the best and the brightest kids at a very early age. So we go and we look at a group of 10-year-olds, and we watch them play hockey or soccer, and we pick the best, right? And we select them out, and we put them in all-star teams, and we give them special coaching and extra practice time and more games and encourage them, right? Thinking that is the best way to capitalize on the talent pool in that particular sport. Right? But think about it. When you're 10 years old, who's going to be the best at a particular activity, physical activity? The oldest kids, right? The kid who was born in January has 10 months of maturity on the kid born in October. And when you're 10 years old, 10 months is an extraordinarily long period of time. It can be 3 or 4 inches in height. It can be the difference between between being clumsy and being massively coordinated. So we think we are picking the best, and we're not. We're picking the oldest, right? And then we take the oldest, and we give them special coaching and all kinds of extra opportunities and all kinds of extra games. And lo and behold, 10 years later, they really are the best, right? But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? We created the conditions that made them the best and foolishly thought we were actually identifying real talent. So third constraint, and I can go on and on about constraints, but I'll stop with the third one. This is in many ways the most fun one and the most controversial one, but I think it's worth digging into. And it's what I would say is an attitudinal constraint on capitalization. So I have a whole chapter in my book which is about this question of why it is that Asian kids do so much better at math than their Western counterparts. Right? Now the numbers here are irrefutable and they're extraordinary, the differences in mathematics performance between kids in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and kids in America, Germany, England, or what have you. In fact, we just got a round of results from these international math test comparisons, I think a couple of weeks ago, and we're talking, the difference is not this, the difference is that. And if you look closely at trying to figure out why, it seems to be the case that the reason for that difference has to do with attitudes. It has to do with what is the attitude with which the child in those two sets of cultures approaches a math problem. And it seems to be the case that when Asian kids sit down and face a high school math problem, they have a different expectation of what solving that problem entails. They have an expectation that if they apply effort to the problem is solvable. Whereas when we look very closely at the attitudes of Western children, they seem to have the attitude that their ability to solve that math problem is a function of their ability, of their innate ability, something they either have or they don't. Right? And that attitudinal difference seems to make have a profound effect on the ability of kids to do well at math, because as it turns out, the Asian approach to mathematics is the correct one. Right? When I say correct, let me give you an example. So these international math tests that we give to kids around the world, they're called TIMS. We give the TIMS every 4 years. It's the same test to kids all over the world. And that's how we come up with these rankings of how countries do. Well, when we give the TIMS to kids, at the same time as we give them the math test, we give them a questionnaire. And the questionnaire is really long. It's 120 questions long. And it asks them all kinds of questions about that will be useful to researchers. So how many hours do you study? Do your parents encourage you? Do you like math? You know, all those kinds of things. But it's really, really long. And it's so long, in fact, that most kids don't finish the questionnaire. It's just too long, right? So a couple of years ago, this really brilliant guy called Erling Boe at Penn decided he would rank the countries of the world by what percentage of questions on the questionnaire their kids finished, right? And you know what he found when he did that ranking and compared it to the ranking of countries on the world by what percentage of questions on the math test their kids got right? The two rankings were exactly the same. And when I say exactly the same, I mean there was a correlation of 0.9. 0.9. In the history of social science, there has never been a correlation of 0.9 between two. It's the same thing. If you want to know how good a country does at mathematics, in other words, you don't have to ask that country's kids any math questions. You just have to make them do a task that requires them to sit down at a seat for an extended period of time and focus on a task. Right? And if they can do it, they're good at math. Really, really fascinating. In other words, what we're saying is when we look at Asian cultures, what we are seeing is this difference in mathematical ability. What we're seeing is not some underlying difference in talent or aptitude for mathematics, but a difference in capitalization. That the Asian cultural attitude about work has the result of being a far more efficient way of capitalizing on math ability than Western attitudes towards work. I talk in the book at one point about how long does it take to be good at something, and this observation by many psychologists that to master a cognitively complex task, whether it's playing chess at an elite level or being a brain surgeon or a classical music composer or a good computer programmer, requires, seemingly without exception, 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. So 10,000 hours is roughly 4 hours a day for 10 years. So you need to put in that kind of time before even the most talented of people, innately talented people can ever achieve an elite status. But I would actually, I don't think this argument, that observation, suggests that people who are older in life, that this is closing doors for people who are older in life. On the contrary, I think it suggests the opposite. That it says that at any point in our lives, if we are in a position to apply ourselves in a formal and rigorous and intensive way to a problem, we should be able to see fruits of that. It says, in other words, that what is special about people who do highly extraordinary or creative acts is not that they are, there's something special, something inherent in their minds, some particular genius, or that there is some magical property associated with youth. Right? On the contrary, it says that no, what sets them apart is that simply that what we are seeing is the necessary and predictable outcome of applying oneself rigorously to a task, something that is available to anyone at any point in their life if they choose to apply themselves in that way.